When Jennifer Collins appeared on the side of the road leading out from the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail in May 2021, she was barely recognizable. Barefoot, gaunt, hair matted and tangled, clothes torn to shreds like she had just stepped out of another world. The woman had been missing 4 years earlier, right in the heart of Gatlinburg, in what was once considered Tennessee's most baffling mystery. But the most terrifying thing wasn't her appearance. The most terrifying thing was what she whispered about those 4 years, about the place where she was held, about the name she recognized in the crowd, and about the person she believed had never stopped watching her. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the latest cases. On the afternoon of May 17, 2017, downtown Gatlinburg was as crowded as usual with people streaming into shops and attractions. But inside the tour coordination office, where 26-year-old Jennifer Collins worked, the atmosphere was winding down a routine workday. Jennifer, who grew up in a family based in Sevierville and was described as someone with careful habits, finished her shift at 5:55, gathered her documents, shut down her computer, and left the office through the back exit that led out to the historic nature trail, a quiet, low-traffic side road she commonly used to reach her personal parking spot. Traffic camera footage captured at the Parkway-Cherokee Orchard Road intersection showed Jennifer appearing at 6:08, wearing a light-colored blouse and carrying a shoulder bag, walking with a steady gait while checking her phone. Patrick Reeves, her direct supervisor, appeared in the same frame just a few seconds later, stepping out the front door of the office and heading in a direction that could have intersected with Jennifer's route. The data shows the distance between them closed briefly before Jennifer turned onto the path leading to the parking area. A second camera positioned on the historic nature trail captured her for the final time at 6:14. The dim late afternoon light caused some graininess in the image, but it still clearly showed Jennifer continuing along her familiar route, heading into the stretch lined with wooden cabins where no further camera coverage existed. This sequence of footage allowed investigators to establish her path and timeline with reasonable accuracy, pinpointing the very short window during which Jennifer completely vanished. The last text message Jennifer sent to her sister at 5:51 was completely normal in tone and content. But after 6:20, every call placed by family members went unanswered. Carrier records show her phone began losing stable signal between 6:25 and 6:30, then entered an unavailable state before powering off completely at 7:32. That time frame became the basis for establishing when Jennifer stopped communicating and when an incident most likely occurred. From 6:30 to 7:30, the Collins family made repeated calls with no response whatsoever, and this unusual silence prompted them to leave Sevierville and drive to Gatlinburg to check on her. They also tried contacting Jennifer's co-workers but received no useful information. When they reached the office area and parking lot and found neither Jennifer nor her personal vehicle, the family concluded the situation was far beyond a normal delay. At 8:02 p.m., they arrived at the Gatlinburg Police Department and filed an official missing person report, officially opening the initial investigation into a disappearance that occurred over a very short distance, under conditions where the city was still busy with people, yet left behind no direct evidence whatsoever, except for the fact that Jennifer's final known route disappeared from every camera in just a few minutes of walking. Right after the missing person report was received, the Gatlinburg Police Department launched an emergency search operation, beginning by cordoning off the entire area surrounding the tour coordination office where Jennifer had left at the end of the afternoon shift, as well as the parking area at Historic Nature Trail. They documented the location of every camera belonging to shops, cabins, ticket booths, and businesses lining the parkway and the intersecting side roads. The primary task during this phase was to collect all surveillance footage from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m., analyze each segment to trace Jennifer's movements, and identify any individuals who appeared unusually within the zones directly related to her travel path. Investigative teams were divided into small groups, each assigned to specific clusters of locations from the souvenir shops, right along the main road, to deeper sites, such as small motels and rented wooden cabins. ensuring no surveillance camera that could have captured Jennifer's final minutes on the street was overlooked. When the collected footage showed that Jennifer's last appearance was on the camera along historic nature trail, but no further steps toward her car were recorded, the search team expanded the scope, sweeping the entire route she normally took after work. From the section connecting Parkway down to River Road, an area with relatively low vehicle traffic in the evening, continuing to the narrow paths leading toward the edge of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where light levels dropped sharply and cover increased significantly. While sweeping along River Road, one search team discovered Jennifer's shoulder bag lying a few meters off the roadside in a position inconsistent with a normal drop trajectory. Investigators immediately marked the scene, took photographs, measured distances, noted the twisted and misaligned strap and the open mouth of the bag, and examined the disarranged contents inside to assess the possibility that the bag had been snatched or thrown during a struggle. From these observations, the forensic team identified several anomalies requiring deeper analysis, including soil traces adhering to the strap and patches of grass flattened around the discovery site. A few dozen meters away, another team found a thin metal bracelet with very small traces of blood adhering to the edge. This led to an immediate cordoning off of the surrounding area within a several-meter radius to collect surface evidence such as drag marks in the soil, broken branches, scratches, or signs of being pulled, in order to determine whether a violent impact had occurred or the victim had been forcibly removed from the main path. The bracelet was sealed according to forensic protocol. Samples were taken for DNA comparison with Jennifer's known profile, and the degree of compatibility with possible injuries during the time of disappearance was evaluated. In addition to collecting physical evidence, the investigative team simultaneously conducted interviews with all employees at the tour coordination office, especially those working the afternoon shift, who were present when Jennifer left the building. The focus of the interviews was Patrick Reeves, whose appearance coincided with the camera frame and who was documented as having left the office just minutes after Jennifer. His answers contained several inconsistencies with the collected data, including an inability to clearly state when he left the building, which direction he went, or whether he had any direct contact with Jennifer. These discrepancies were recorded in the official notes for cross-referencing with other evidence. When the route sweep failed to reveal any further direction of Jennifer's movement, police deployed a K-9 unit to track scent from personal items obtained from her office and home. The K-9 team moved along the River Road route and the small turnoffs leading toward the forest. However, the scent trails all broke off after a few dozen meters and did not form a continuous path, severely limiting the ability to determine the direction in which Jennifer may have been taken. Ground support teams expanded the search over a wider area around the forest edge, deploying personnel in a grid-pattern sweep, but no additional items or valuable new traces were found. The investigative units compiled all surveillance footage, locations of discovered evidence, interview information, and K-9 search results for continued analysis, determining the strong possibility that Jennifer left the area against her will. At the same time, they noted that neither the shoulder bag nor the bracelet provided sufficient directional information, creating a major data gap in efforts to establish the victim's movements during the critical first 72 hours. As soon as the initial 72-hour search yielded no clear leads, and subsequent sweeps over the following weeks still failed to uncover additional evidence or traces of movement, Jennifer's missing person file continued to be updated on a routine cycle, but with no new developments. This caused the entire investigative effort to gradually slow down, in line with Gatlinburg Police Department protocol for cases that show no fresh signals after a prolonged period. By May 2018, exactly 12 months after Jennifer disappeared, the file was formally transferred to the cold case unit of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation because every piece of information retrieved from cameras, collected physical evidence, location data, and witness statements failed to form any chain of leads capable of advancing the investigation in any specific direction. The transfer occurred after a full year-long re-review of all investigative materials, including scene reports from the locations where the shoulder bag and bracelet were found, forensic analysis results, historical phone data, and every summons of company employees to clarify the last moments Jennifer was seen in the work environment. The cold case unit began by re-examining personnel records to identify any internal factors that could be directly tied to a possible motive. During this process, internal company emails recovered from the tourism company's archived system revealed that Jennifer had been preparing to send an official report to the HR department regarding harassing behavior by Patrick Reeves, her direct supervisor. The draft email contained detailed descriptions of incidents that made Jennifer fear for her personal safety at work, including Patrick deliberately touching her body during work hours and attempting to approach her at times when few people were present in the office. This became key data, establishing a conflict element, and provided grounds to consider the strong possibility of a motive tied to preventing Jennifer from submitting that formal report. After the email content was authenticated, the investigative team expanded verification efforts concerning Patrick, including confirming changes to his residence immediately following the disappearance. Patrick's residency records showed that he left Gatlinburg and moved to Knoxville just a few weeks after Jennifer vanished, around the same time he submitted his resignation from the company. The speed of this change in living environment, combined with the inconsistencies in his initial interview statements, caused Patrick's behavior to be placed on the list of highly suspicious factors. The cold case team prepared a behavioral analysis report based on the sudden departure from employment, the timing of the relocation, and information related to his relationship with Jennifer, ultimately assessing Patrick as belonging to the group of subjects with the highest plausible motive in the file. In parallel with the internal factor review, the cold case unit updated and recompared the DNA sample recovered from the bracelet found on River Road. That DNA sample had been analyzed early in the investigation and entered into CODIS, but the 2017 comparison produced no matching profiles. In 2018, the sample was again submitted to an expanded comparison database to check against newly added records. Yet the results still failed to identify any individual connected to the case, significantly limiting the evidentiary value of that item. The inability to match the DNA, together with the complete absence of direct eyewitnesses, meant the investigation could not move forward to the stage of identifying who may have had contact with Jennifer after the final camera footage. The River Road evidence was re-examined to assess the likelihood of an incident, collision, or struggle at the precise spots where the bag and bracelet were discovered, but the surface traces were either too minor or had been largely erased by weather over time. The cold case unit noted that no evidence indicated the victim had left the area of her own volition, while no secondary camera footage captured Jennifer moving beyond her established route. Aside from Patrick Reeves, no other individual appeared within the same time window or had a route intersection with Jennifer, sufficient to justify inclusion on a suspect list. Nevertheless, investigators still could not reach any legally binding conclusion that would tie Patrick to the disappearance scene, because there was no physical evidence directly connecting him to any location where Jennifer might have been after the flood. Last camera recording at 6:14 p.m. on May 17, 2017. After compiling all data from the first year, the conclusion was clearly documented in the cold case file. The potential motive linked to workplace harassment was the strongest factor present, but there was no physical evidence, no location pings, and no clear movement pattern for either the victim or any suspect that would establish Jennifer's whereabouts at any point after 6:14 p.m. on May 17, 2017. The lack of both new evidence and any critical matches forced the case to be temporarily shelved in a pending information status. The file remains open and investigative efforts continue, but there is insufficient data to expand the investigation in any specific direction. Right after the sun dipped behind the dense tree canopy of the forest east of Gatlinburg in the afternoon of May 25, 2021, a group of tourists, slowly driving along the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail, reported seeing a woman step out of the thick woods at a narrow curve near the area with the bear warning sign, where the terrain is steep and few people stop. When the vehicle made an emergency stop, the first person to approach noted that she was standing unsteadily on the damp ground, body leaning forward as if about to collapse, barefoot, and covered in dirt with numerous deep scratches. The location was precisely documented in the scene report as approximately 1 mile from the road's entrance. The woman's physical condition was described as extremely emaciated. Pale skin, cracked dry lips, deeply sunken eyes, unsteady and swaying gait, slow breathing, clear signs of prolonged dehydration, accompanied by severe malnutrition evident in prominently visible ribs beneath her torn and frayed clothing. The clothes she wore were inappropriate for the weather conditions and showed multiple irregularly torn sections. Her left wrist and ankles still bore old indentations, consistent with being restrained for an extended period. Her hair was matted and tangled, her skin coated in a distinctive red dirt dust typical of deeper forest areas, suggesting she had likely been in an uncared-for condition for a prolonged time. The witnesses reported that when a man from the tourist group stepped closer to offer help, she immediately reacted by jerking backward toward the forest, instinctively raising her arms to shield her head, her entire body trembling violently and emitting sounds that were hard to distinguish between fear and exhaustion, clearly showing extreme sensitivity to perceived threats. When the man backed away, she maintained the defensive posture for several seconds before two women from the group approached slowly from the opposite direction, keeping their distance and speaking softly to avoid triggering further panic. Recognizing the severity of her physical collapse, the tourists called 911, described the victim's condition, and requested immediate rescue team response. When the Gatlinburg Fire Department's rapid response unit arrived, they recorded a weak pulse, low blood pressure, and a body temperature below normal range, determining this was an immediate life-threatening emergency. Medical personnel administered oral electrolyte solution, covered her with an emergency thermal blanket, and placed the victim on a rigid stretcher for transport out of the forested area, while police secured and cordoned off the surrounding scene to preserve evidence. Transport was carried out by ambulance to a hospital in Knoxville because the victim's condition exceeded the capabilities of closer medical facilities. During the journey, she repeatedly drifted in and out of consciousness, but the only sounds she could produce were disjointed syllables without clear meaning, continuing to indicate severe physical and mental deterioration. At the hospital, the initial processing protocol was activated as soon as the ambulance reached the emergency room. The victim was immediately isolated from crowded areas to prevent stimulation-induced panic, placed on a specialized bed, given a comprehensive injury assessment, and started on intravenous fluids to stabilize vital signs. Doctors quickly identified signs of long-term confinement through localized muscle atrophy, old indentations on the wrists and ankles, and a state of malnutrition reflecting a prolonged period without regular access to food. Gatlinburg police coordinated with the hospital to use photographs of the victim's face, cross-referencing them against lists of missing women in Tennessee and neighboring regions. When numerous characteristics matched the missing person file of Jennifer Collins, investigators immediately conducted cross-verification by collecting family-provided images, comparing fingerprints, facial bone structure, distinctive moles, and other identifying features documented in the 2017 file. The identification process proceeded urgently, with every detail reviewed multiple times to rule out random coincidence, while hospital security tightened the isolation area to ensure the victim was not approached or influenced by strangers during the identification phase. At the same time, doctors performed blood tests to assess infection status, electrolyte imbalances, and the risk of acute organ damage due to prolonged exhaustion. Initial findings indicated the victim had endured a period of living without medical care or basic living conditions, reflecting a significant degree of deprivation in her environment over a substantial length of time. Based on all data collected at the scene and in the hospital, the file officially recorded the afternoon of May 25, 2021, as the moment the woman was found in a near-total state of collapse and entered the standard emergency treatment and legal identity verification process used in cases of long-term disappearances. Right after the victim was stabilized in the isolation area of the Knoxville Hospital, the forensic team, in coordination with the investigative unit, initiated the DNA collection protocol standardized for missing persons cases where the individual is found unable to self-identify. This included taking oral mucosa swabs, blood samples, and documenting every identifying physical characteristic on the body in preparation for comparison. These samples were urgently submitted to the CODIS system and simultaneously compared directly against the archived missing person profile of Jennifer Collins from 2017, which included biometric data collected from her family and from her personal documents. When the DNA analysis results returned with an absolute match, the investigative team immediately recorded that the victim was Jennifer Collins, officially resolving the identity question that had remained unanswered for more than 4 years with no prior confirmation signals. This positive identification provided a solid foundation for the entire investigative file and ended the prolonged state of uncertainty that had complicated efforts to assess survival likelihood. Following confirmation, doctors continued with a comprehensive physical evaluation to assess the extent of damage Jennifer had endured. The report documented severe weight loss compared to 2017 records, with her body weight reduced by more than 30% from her pre-disappearance baseline. Clearly visible localized muscle atrophy in multiple areas indicated prolonged periods of inadequate movement or restricted mobility. Prominent old indentations remained clearly visible on her wrists and ankles, consistent with extended binding or restraint, while unevenly healed older wounds reflected a long-term lack of medical care. Some areas of skin showed mild discoloration, suggestive of sustained pressure or contact with rough surfaces in a confined living environment. Doctors also noted several fresh abrasions consistent with information that Jennifer had emerged from dense forest undergrowth just before being discovered. During the examination, the medical team carefully assessed sensitive factors using general clinical terminology to avoid additional psychological impact on the victim at this stage. The physical marks indicated she had experienced prolonged restriction of freedom and neglectful treatment, without employing direct descriptions of highly sensitive specific behaviors. After completing the initial examination, all data was standardized per forensic file requirements, including photographs of each injured region, classification of marks by estimated time of formation, and a detailed report on the degree of malnutrition, physical deconditioning, and biological stability at the time of admission. This report was forwarded to the investigative division to serve as an official document within the victim status verification file. Standardizing the data was a critical step to ensure that all conclusions regarding bodily condition and residual marks were recorded according to forensic standards, supporting future analysis and preserving evidentiary value. Once identity was confirmed, authorities followed the established protocol for notifying families in long-term missing persons cases. The initial call was placed in a private hospital room, where an investigative representative informed the family that the woman found on the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail had been positively identified as Jennifer. The family was asked to come to the hospital for direct in-person identification and was given guidance on steps to follow to protect the victim's mental health from any sudden reappearance of relatives. Upon the family's arrival, the hospital arranged a discreet, controlled area where medical staff monitored Jennifer's psychological responses and managed the surrounding environment to minimize any risk of triggering fear or panic. Although Jennifer's physical condition still did not allow normal communication, identification was confirmed through distinctive facial features. The small scar noted prior to 2017 and matching biological characteristics. An official record was created, affirming that the victim had been fully identified in accordance with legal standards, thereby opening the next phase of medical management and evidence collection for the investigation. After completing this process, Jennifer's complete initial medical file was integrated into the investigative system, marking the creation of a comprehensive dataset documenting the victim's condition upon reappearance. This included vital signs, injuries, degree of health deterioration, and clinical notes describing the prolonged endurance she had undergone, helping to build a fuller picture of what she experienced during her 4 years of absence. Right after Jennifer's vital signs were stabilized and her basic parameters were no longer in a critical range, the medical expert team, in coordination with the forensic psychology unit, began the process of compiling an injury profile grouped by manifestation stages. They clearly divided the injuries into early stage, mid-stage, and long-term stage categories, based on the timing of histological feature formation, degree of scar healing, and soft tissue structure. Injuries in the blunt force trauma group included faded bruises that had changed color, mild axis deviations in the wrist bones, and several old bone cracks that had healed incompletely on their own, indicating the victim had suffered external force impacts in the past, received no medical intervention, and was forced to recover under restricted conditions. The second group of injuries related to restraints was documented through circular indentations around the wrists and ankles. While the outlines were no longer sharply defined, they were still sufficient to confirm repeated, prolonged pressure patterns. The skin structure in these areas showed localized callousing and extended discoloration, reflecting irregular cycles of tightening-loosening-tightening. The third group of injuries related to malnutrition was evident through marked muscle mass loss, a BMI that had dropped well below the safe threshold, and blood markers indicating long-term deficiencies in key vitamins and minerals, particularly vitamin D, calcium, and iron, conditions commonly seen in individuals deprived of natural sunlight exposure over extended periods. The final group involved movement restriction injuries, observed through asymmetrical muscle atrophy in specific regions and reduced flexibility in the knee joints, ankles, and elbows, reflecting life in a confined space that limited full extension of muscles and prevented normal physical activity. All of these features were organized chronologically in the file based on their progression levels, allowing reconstruction of the living conditions Jennifer was forced to endure during her period of disappearance. When conducting a deeper analysis of bodily indices, the specialist team documented a series of clear signs indicating the victim had been confined in a dark, damp environment completely devoid of natural light. Whole body depigmentation, combined with prolonged vitamin D deficiency, served as strong indicators of no sunlight exposure for consecutive periods spanning many months. Subnormal resting body temperature, abnormally reduced bone density for a young adult, and electrolyte imbalances reflecting irregular eating and drinking patterns further confirmed living conditions in a severely restricted space where the body could not maintain a normal biological rhythm. In addition, abnormally elevated cortisol levels in blood samples showed the victim had endured prolonged psychological stress, leading to physiological consequences such as insomnia, disrupted eating patterns, reduced emotional self-regulation, and weakened immunity. The behavioral assessment was conducted by forensic psychology experts following protocols for victims subjected to prolonged freedom restriction. While observing Jennifer's initial reactions to her surroundings, the specialist recorded multiple avoidance behaviors. Whenever someone approached too closely, she immediately hunched her shoulders, tilted her head to one side, or raised her arms in a defensive posture, regardless of whether the person's behavior was friendly. In the hospital environment, even small sounds such as a door closing, metal clinking, or rapid footsteps caused her to startle violently, followed by a reflexive retreat toward the corner of the room. These are classic signs of hypervigilance developed after years of living in a highly threatening environment. During ongoing monitoring, the psychology team also documented severe time disorientation. In Jennifer, she could not distinguish day from night, could not recall recent time markers, and repeatedly asked the same question about the current time. This disorder commonly emerges when a victim is cut off from natural light cycles and lacks access to clocks, resulting in complete disruption of circadian rhythms. One critical detail identified during the initial debriefing was Jennifer's intense reaction to low-frequency, repetitive sounds, mimicking the continuous operation of a generator. When a doctor accidentally activated a device producing a similar vibration, Jennifer immediately covered her ears, bent forward sharply, and displayed extreme panic signs. This response indicated that her nervous system had been conditioned for survival in an environment with years of constant, monotonous but powerful mechanical noise that continuously impacted her auditory processing and created involuntary memory triggers. Experts concluded that prolonged exposure to such sounds can readily lead to autonomic nervous system dysregulation, diminished ability to differentiate sounds, and the formation of extreme avoidance reflexes to similar frequencies. In parallel with the medical and behavioral analyses, the psychology team prepared conditions for taking statements according to standards for long-term confinement victims. The established conditions included: the interview room must have soft lighting and no sudden noises. The number of personnel interacting with the victim must be strictly limited and maintain appropriate distance. Language used must remain neutral and avoid direct prompting that recalls frightening situations. Interview pacing must be adjusted according to the victim's reactions and supervised by a psychologist to detect signs of overload. The investigative team was also required to adhere to principles of no pressure, no demands for Jennifer to describe sensitive events directly in the early phase, and to focus solely on stabilizing her psychology and creating a minimal sense of safety in preparation for legally compliant information gathering. All of these elements were documented in the official record to ensure victim contact followed proper procedure, prevent secondary trauma, and preserve the quality of any future statements once she was capable of clearer communication. As soon as Jennifer was stable enough to handle basic questions within the framework of a controlled psychological evaluation, the investigative team began recording the first pieces of information about the sequence of events surrounding the time of her disappearance, with the primary focus on the relationship between Jennifer and Patrick Reeves in the workplace. According to her statement, this was not a normal coworker relationship, but one that had stretched over many months in a state of tension, because Patrick repeatedly tried to approach Jennifer in ways that went far beyond professional boundaries. Jennifer clearly described how he would frequently stand too close, use suggestive language, and create situations that made her uncomfortable during work hours. These approaches initially seemed sporadic, but over time they developed into a repeating pattern of behavior that made Jennifer feel increasingly unsafe in her work environment. Because of the sensitive nature of the issue, she had taken notes on multiple incidents and prepared documentation to submit to the company's Human Resources Department to report this conduct. According to her statement, she had partially completed the HR report in the week leading up to her disappearance, and a draft email detailing the incidents involving Patrick remained on her work computer. This information matched exactly what the cold case team had recovered during their analysis of internal company emails. Jennifer stated that Patrick somehow became aware she was gathering information for the report, possibly because he saw her printing documents or noticed her activity history on the computer. From that point onward, according to Jennifer, Patrick's demeanor changed noticeably. He became tense and guarded, yet at the same time, the intensity of his approaches toward her increased in a controlling direction. The investigative team identified this as a direct motive, since the professional and legal threat posed by the impending report could have prompted Patrick to intervene before it was submitted. In her statement, Jennifer described the moment Patrick asked to meet her in the parking lot at the end of the afternoon on May 17, 2017. According to her account, Patrick approached her right after the shift ended, using a tone that suggested he needed to clear up a misunderstanding about work. Jennifer refused to talk there and said she needed to head home immediately, but Patrick continued to follow her, claiming he wanted to speak privately to avoid affecting the office atmosphere. When Jennifer headed toward the historic nature trail, Patrick quickened his pace to get ahead of her and insisted on talking in the parking area, which had even less foot traffic. Jennifer recounted that she tried to maintain distance and refused to engage, but Patrick kept closing in, displaying unusual tension. She said she felt unsafe at that exact moment when she noticed Patrick repeatedly scanning the area to check whether anyone else was present. According to her statement, the situation escalated to physical assault almost immediately when Jennifer tried to step back to avoid him. She recalled a sudden, sharp pain on the right side of her head, followed by complete darkness and no further awareness of what was happening. Medical reports documented a small fracture in the temporal bone, consistent with impact from a hard object or direct blow, aligning precisely with what Jennifer described. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying on her side in the back seat of a vehicle, her hands secured with coarse rope tied so tightly that the skin around her wrists felt numb and burned. The interior of the vehicle was dark. There was a faint smell of motor oil, and the low vibration of the engine told her the car was still moving. In a state of panic and severe headache, Jennifer tried to call out, but her voice came out extremely weak, and every movement was restricted by the bindings, preventing her from sitting up. In her statement, Jennifer described how, shortly after waking in the vehicle, Patrick stopped the car briefly on a deserted stretch of road, opened the rear door, and approached her in a highly agitated state. Jennifer was unable to recount in detail what happened immediately after Patrick opened the door, but the terms she used indicated she was treated in a manner that completely stripped her of any ability to defend herself and plunged her into a state of absolute terror. The investigative team recorded this portion of the statement using mitigated language to avoid causing further psychological harm. while adhering to forensic guidelines by noting that an act of coercive nature occurred over a very brief period at this temporary location. After Patrick closed the car door and resumed driving, Jennifer said she completely lost any sense of direction. She only perceived the engine sound growing louder than usual as the vehicle entered rougher terrain with increasing jolts and vibrations. Those sounds, she described, had the distinctive resonance of dirt roads or unpaved trails. During the periods of consciousness, interspersed with unconsciousness, as the vehicle continued moving, Jennifer only retained vague impressions. The light outside the windows gradually grew darker, there was strong wind noise outside, and no more traffic sounds around them, indicating Patrick had taken her to a remote, unpopulated area. She lost consciousness again when the vehicle finally stopped before she was removed from it. The details Jennifer provided in her statement formed the first coherent chain of information that helped establish the circumstances of the initial approach, the direct motive leading to the assault, the method used to incapacitate resistance, and the victim's condition upon regaining awareness in the confined space inside the vehicle, all critical elements for constructing the initial timeline of events on the night of May 17, 2017. In her subsequent statement regarding the phase after being taken away from the main urban area of Gatlinburg, Jennifer described that after the vehicle left the temporary stopping point on the road, the car continued driving for a much longer period than the distance from the office to the parking lot, which made her realize Patrick was taking her out of the city center. Based on the regular changes in engine sound and the vibration of the road surface, Jennifer said the vehicle transitioned from smooth pavement to rougher sections, consistent with routes leading into the Greenbrier area on the eastern edge of Great Smoky Mountains. She described the sensation of the car tilting slightly with each curve, the sound of rocks scraping under the chassis, and the quiet surroundings indicating the vehicle had left populated areas. When asked about distinctive sounds, Jennifer said she heard the distant echo of running water and the sound of leaves brushing against the vehicle, two elements consistent with the terrain of Greenbrier, which features numerous small streams and dense forest right up to the road. When the vehicle finally came to a complete stop, Patrick opened the rear door and pulled her out while her hands remained bound. Jennifer described the ground under her feet as soft dirt mixed with loose gravel, along with the characteristic damp smell of decaying leaves. She was led forward while unable to maintain balance, and only after being brought into an enclosed space with a thin wooden floor did she realize this was the place of confinement. According to her description, the cabin Patrick took her into was an old, small, and dilapidated wooden structure, not located in any tourist or residential area. Jennifer noted that the cabin had only one entrance door secured with an old metal lock from the outside. No functioning windows, only panels that had been boarded up with planks making the interior dark and extremely stuffy. The thin wooden walls, combined with the cabin's natural sound insulation due to being surrounded by thick forest, meant sounds from inside had difficulty carrying outward, and external noises were greatly reduced. The cabin floor creaked faintly every time she moved, and the interior space was only large enough for a wooden cot, a small table, and a few old items. This was the place where Jennifer was held during the initial phase after being removed from Gatlinburg. During the first 3 months, Jennifer described being under absolute control. She was not allowed to leave the cabin, and only saw Patrick when he opened the door and entered. These appearances were typically accompanied by controlling behavior intended to make her feel completely deprived of autonomy. The coercive acts were described by her in softer terms to avoid psychological harm, but still clearly conveyed that she was forced to endure a series of experiences that diminished her ability to resist. Patrick always carried the key and locked the cabin from the outside each time he left. Jennifer did not know how long he stayed away, nor did she know if he left at any fixed time, because there was no natural light or external environmental sounds to help her track time. Every time Patrick came to the cabin, it created enormous psychological pressure on Jennifer because she could not predict the purpose of his visit, keeping her in a prolonged state of defensiveness. After the initial 3-month period of tight control, Jennifer stated that Patrick's frequency of appearances began to gradually decrease. He no longer entered the cabin every day as before, and sometimes disappeared for 2 or 3 consecutive days. However, this did not mean she was given any relief. On the contrary, Being left alone in the middle of the forest inside a sealed space made her feel even more disoriented and completely dependent on the meager food supply Patrick left behind. Her meals were always minimal, sometimes consisting only of a little canned food or a small portion of cold leftovers. Water supply was also inconsistent, forcing Jennifer to restrict movement to avoid total exhaustion. When Patrick returned, he usually brought food and water, but the level of interaction dropped significantly, maintained only at the minimum needed to keep her from complete collapse. Jennifer described this as the point when he began to care less about direct supervision, shifting the confinement pattern toward isolation and severe activity restriction, rather than close, constant presence. Based on the details Jennifer provided about Patrick's frequency of visits, the investigative team constructed a timeline of his cabin entry and exit cycle during the confinement period. According to her statement, during the early months, Patrick appeared almost daily, but later this dropped to a few times per week and continued to decrease to roughly 1 to 2 times. Occasionally, Patrick would be gone for longer stretches, 4 to 5 days, leaving Jennifer uncertain whether he would ever return. Each time Patrick arrived, she could identify his presence through the distinctive sound of the metal key scraping against the lock and his heavy footsteps on the wooden floor. Jennifer described how, over time, her ears became extremely sensitive to these two sounds and could easily distinguish them even when she was in a half-conscious state. Her statement also revealed that the intervals between Patrick's appearances were inconsistent, making it impossible for her to rely on any pattern to adjust her routine or plan an escape during this phase. The information Jennifer provided in her description of the transport and initial confinement became critical evidence for determining the geographic characteristics, the degree of isolation of the holding location, and Patrick's living habits during the early stage, forming the first foundation for reconstructing the route and conditions of confinement during the nearly 3 months after she was forcibly removed from central Gatlinburg. In the statement taken during the phase when Jennifer was stable enough to provide more detailed descriptions of her confinement period, the forced daily routine inside the cabin was maintained in a monotonous and harsh pattern, with no noticeable variation from day to day or week to week, since Jennifer had no way to determine the passage of time. She described that eating occurred entirely at Patrick's discretion and followed no fixed rhythm. Sometimes he would bring a small amount of food while she was asleep, forcing her to estimate time based solely on feelings of hunger or fatigue. Jennifer's sleep was dictated by the complete absence of natural light, causing her to sleep in short, irregular bursts, rather than following a day-night cycle. Each time Patrick appeared, he always locked the door from the outside when he left, making it impossible for Jennifer to leave the cabin space and forcing her to live in a state of total restriction. In her statement, Jennifer described many occasions when she woke up with no memory of how long she had slept and no idea whether Patrick had already come or not, because there was no pattern whatsoever to help her track his appearances. This was the factor that completely shattered her daily cycle and made her existence dependent on random intervals when the cabin door opened. Jennifer described the cabin as a confinement space with consistent physical characteristics throughout the entire 4 years. The red dirt floor caused her clothes, hair, and skin to always be coated in a fine layer of dust. The cabin carried a persistent smell of motor oil coming from a fuel drum and the generator engine placed behind the cabin, which Patrick used to provide limited lighting or power small devices. The sound of the generator became a familiar, unending noise that repeated in a steady, rough vibration cycle, and Jennifer noted that this was the sound that accompanied her throughout the entire time she was held. When the generator was running, the cabin had very dim light from a single small bulb. But that light was never enough for Jennifer to distinguish any time of day. When the generator was off, the cabin plunged into complete darkness, with no natural light source whatsoever because all windows had been permanently boarded up. The combination of musty dampness, rotting wood, dirt, dust, and motor oil created the distinctive atmosphere of the cabin, and Jennifer said she never felt any natural airflow inside the holding space except for tiny drafts of cold air that seeped through small gaps in the wooden walls. In the prolonged state of isolation, Jennifer described how the 4 years of confinement caused her to completely lose any concept of time. There was no sunlight, no change in environmental sounds, and no object whatsoever to help her count the passage of days and nights. She recounted that sometimes a single day felt as long as many weeks, while at other times time seemed to pass so quickly that she could not determine how many sleep-wake cycles she had gone through. The total absence of any human presence except Patrick plunged her into absolute isolation. Jennifer described how she once tried counting the number of times the generator turned on and off to estimate time. But because Patrick never used the generator according to any pattern, every attempt to track time failed. This isolation led to mild perceptual disturbances, at times causing her to hear sounds without knowing whether they were real, external noises, or simply her nervous system reacting after long periods without natural stimulation. The descriptions related to the surroundings of the cabin were particularly important in her statement, because Jennifer remembered that even though the cabin was isolated from the forest environment, she could still hear the steady, quiet sound of a small stream running not too far away, especially when Patrick turned off the generator. This sound had a consistent rhythm, indicating the cabin was located near a natural watercourse, likely a small tributary of Greenbrier Creek. Jennifer described that when she pressed her ear against the right-hand wooden wall of the cabin, the sound of water became much clearer than from any other position, suggesting that the terrain outside in that direction was lower. She also noted the occasional sound of footsteps or leaves rustling in the forest during the rare moments when the cabin was quiet, but she never heard any human voices other than Patrick's. From her perception in the darkness, Jennifer believed the cabin was not right beside the main road, but was set back some distance along a narrow trail, because every now and then she could hear the faint, distant sound of a vehicle engine very weak, indicating a considerable distance. Another critical detail Jennifer reported was that Patrick had no fixed schedule for visiting the cabin, making it impossible for her to predict when he would appear. Jennifer described how sometimes he would come multiple times in a single day, but other times he would disappear for 3 or 4 days without leaving any sign. When he arrived, he would leave a minimal amount of food and just enough water to last a short while. This forced Jennifer to ration her portions very carefully to stretch them out, because she could never know when the next supply would arrive. This uncertainty became a powerful means of mental control, keeping Jennifer in a constant state of heightened alertness and fear of total exhaustion. She remembered that the characteristic sounds, signaling Patrick's arrival, were his heavy footsteps on the red dirt outside, followed by the metallic clink of the key against the lock just before the cabin door opened. Every time she heard those sounds, her body reacted reflexively, holding her breath, heart racing because she could never predict the purpose of Patrick's entry into the cabin. Throughout Jennifer's entire statement regarding the long-term confinement process, all the facts point to a survival condition restricted to the absolute minimum, a confinement space structure that remained virtually unchanged over the years, and Patrick's unpredictable appearances that made any calculation of timing or patterns completely impossible. These are the elements that allow the reconstruction of a clear picture of the degree of isolation, living conditions, and forced routine that Jennifer was forced to endure during the approximately 4 years she was held in the cabin deep within the Greenbrier area. In her statement regarding the events leading up to her escape from the cabin, Jennifer described that on May 23, 2021, she heard the generator behind the cabin running unstably. The familiar steady vibration suddenly became intermittent, then turned into a heavy clanking noise, completely different from the continuous motor sound it had made before. This unusual sound lasted only a few minutes before shutting off completely, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. Not long after, Jennifer heard Patrick's hurried footsteps circling around to the back of the cabin, accompanied by a loud scraping noise as he dragged something heavy across the dirt ground, indicating he was attempting to repair the generator or check the power source. Because the generator was the only device Patrick relied on to produce light and run a few small items, its malfunction made Jennifer realize this was one of the rare moments when Patrick had to leave the cabin door area without securing her with the secondary metal latch as he usually did. While Patrick was still at the back of the cabin, Jennifer happened to notice a small metal bar lying next to the foot of the wooden cot, something she believed Patrick had forgotten there from a previous lock repair. The metal bar was about the length of a forearm, slightly curved at one end, with a rusted surface, and rigid enough to serve as a prying tool if she could find the right leverage point. Recognizing what was almost certainly the only opportunity she had had in many years, Jennifer picked up the metal bar with one hand, since her wrist was still painful, and felt along the edge of the door to locate the latch position. She described that the cabin door had 2 layers of locking, a main lock on the outside and a secondary latch on the inside, which Patrick normally tightened by hand each time he closed the door. This time, because he had left in such a hurry, the secondary latch had not been fully tightened. Jennifer inserted the metal bar into the gap below, using all her remaining strength to twist and push, forcing the latch out of alignment. After several failed attempts that caused the metal bar to slip from her hand and fall to the floor, she finally heard a soft click, signaling that the latch had released. The door slowly swung open, bringing in a rush of cold, damp outside air that made her realize she had just broken free from the boundary that had held her captive for 4 years. When she stepped out of the cabin, Jennifer described how the bare soles of her feet immediately stung with pain from the dirt mixed with sharp gravel, but she forced herself to stay silent, to avoid making any noise that might bring Patrick back. The forest light was already very low because dusk was approaching, so Jennifer had to move purely by instinct and by the memory of the stream sound she had heard from inside the cabin. She headed in the direction where the sound of running water was clearest, believing the stream might lead to a larger road. The escape happened just as the forest began to sink into the pale green twilight, so Jennifer could only see faint tree silhouettes and a path filled with hard roots. She kept stumbling over rocks or falling to the ground from exhaustion, but the thought of putting distance between herself and the cabin kept her moving forward. After an undetermined amount of time, Jennifer noticed light in the distance reflecting through the tree canopy, a type of light completely different from the dim glow of the generator, steadier in rhythm, and carrying a white-yellow hue, similar to the light reflected from vehicles on the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail. She moved toward that light, using it as her only landmark to avoid getting lost deeper in the forest. According to her statement, the terrain on the final stretch was very steep, forcing her to grab tree trunks, rocks, or thick brush with her hands to keep from sliding. However, just as she neared the road edge, her foot caught on a large root, causing her to tumble forward and roll down onto the soft dirt right beside the road shoulder. Her attempts to stand failed because her entire body had no strength left, so she could only crawl weakly until her face touched the rough surface of the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail. She recounted that in the moment she looked up, she saw headlights from far away and several human figures approaching. However, because her memory and perception at that time were heavily shaped by 4 years of seeing Patrick as the only man who ever appeared around her, the sight of a man in the group of tourists instantly made her associate him with Patrick, triggering a panicked bodily reaction as she tried to retreat, even though she no longer had the strength to move. This was why she behaved as though she were facing a familiar threat, even though in reality it was the group of people who had discovered and rescued her. Everything Jennifer described, the sound of the stream, the direction she took, the curved road light, and the exhausted journey that ended with her collapsing beside the road, formed a crucial chain of facts that helped reconstruct her escape route and pinpoint the exact location where she was found by the public. Right after obtaining Jennifer's detailed statement about her confinement period, the investigative team reopened the case file, with the primary focus on cross-referencing all new facts against the information originally recorded in 2017, in order to reconstruct the movement route and identify the excess fault of cross-reference, cabin's location. The first step was to compare Jennifer's description of the cabin's physical characteristics, including the red dirt floor, proximity to a stream, the steepness of the terrain, degree of separation from any trail, and the interior spatial layout with topographic maps of the Greenbrier Forest area. Greenbrier contains numerous small stream branches and characteristic red soil areas mixed with loose gravel. But not every section matched Jennifer's full description. The investigative team used elevation maps, topographic maps, combined with GIS data to narrow the search zone to locations containing abandoned cabins or old wooden structures situated near tributaries of Greenbrier Creek. When cross-referencing the stream sound, Jennifer described low-pitched, steady, and not overly loud. Specialists determined it was most likely a small side branch rather than the main stream, helping to rule out areas with larger, louder waterways. A compiled data set of unregistered cabins within the forest area was then assembled, including cabins abandoned after wildfires, privately owned cabins no longer in use, and old structures located deep within Greenbrier Cove. In parallel with verifying the cabin location, the investigative team reviewed Patrick's movement history during the 2016-2018 period, based on citizen reports, ranger logs, and vehicle registration activity data for entries into forest areas. According to ranger records, Patrick had been warned in 2016 for parking in an unauthorized spot near a secondary Greenbrier entrance. Additionally, in 2017, two informal reports from hikers noted a dark-colored Jeep Grand Cherokee parked deep in the woods, at times inconsistent with typical recreational activity. At the time, those reports were not linked to any case and were not pursued, but when cross-referenced with Jennifer's statement indicating she frequently heard vehicles arriving on irregular cycles, these records gained significant value. Although the ranger reports did not specify license plates, they described the Jeep as having thick red dirt buildup and a noticeable motor oil smell elements, consistent with Jennifer's description of a confinement environment featuring generator noise and red dirt surrounding the cabin. The investigative team then re-examined all traffic camera footage along the route from downtown Gatlinburg to Greenbrier during the period from April to June 2017 to determine whether Patrick's Jeep Grand Cherokee appeared in the data sequence. One traffic camera positioned near the turnoff into Greenbrier captured a vehicle matching the color and model of Patrick's Jeep entering the forest on the evening of May 17, 2017, within a time frame closely aligned with the window of Jennifer's disappearance. That footage had previously been deemed insufficient for evidentiary purposes because it lacked driver identification and clear license plate information, but when combined with the news statement detailing Jennifer being transported immediately after the assault, this became a critical connecting piece. No other cameras recorded the vehicle exiting during the immediate follow-up period, reinforcing the likelihood that it continued deeper into the forest exactly as Jennifer described. At the same time as expanding the camera image review, the investigative team revisited the personnel file from the company where Jennifer and Patrick had worked. Management reports confirmed that Patrick submitted his sudden resignation just 2 weeks after Jennifer's disappearance. Tax records and residency information showed that he left Gatlinburg shortly afterward, rented a room in Knoxville for a brief period, then moved again to another location. This pattern of continuous relocation was analyzed as behavior intended to avoid familiar surroundings and reduce the chance of being questioned, especially since it coincided with the point at which he no longer had any legitimate reason to remain in Gatlinburg. When all data were cross-referenced, investigators noted that Patrick's rapid change of residence and abrupt cessation of contact with former co-workers shortly after the disappearance constituted highly unusual conduct, warranting close scrutiny. Another key step was linking Jennifer's new statement to the locations of the two pieces of evidence recovered in 2017. The shoulder bag on River Road and the blood-stained bracelet found nearby. In her statement, Jennifer described being pulled from the vehicle at a point a short distance from the cabin after the blow to her head and then being taken directly into the cabin. When investigators compared this with the location of the bag on River Road, they noted that the area lies exactly along the route Patrick would have taken when transporting Jennifer out of central Gatlinburg toward Greenbrier. The bag's position several meters off the roadside suggested it could have been dragged along or ejected from the vehicle during a struggle before Patrick left the populated area. The blood-stained bracelet discovered a short distance from the bag in a low-grass area adjacent to the forest matched Jennifer's description of wrist injuries caused by tight rope restraint during the assault and her attempts to resist. When the DNA sample from the bracelet was recompared with Jennifer's current blood sample, the results showed a complete match, confirming that this was direct evidence tied to the moment she was approached. By synthesizing all the data from forest maps, traffic camera records, Patrick's residency history, ranger reports, and the original evidence locations, the investigative team established a seamless connection between Jennifer's statement and the previously fragmented facts from 2017. This created the foundational structure for reconstructing Patrick's travel route from central Gatlinburg into the Greenbrier area on the night Jennifer disappeared, while also confirming the consistency between her statement and the physical scene evidence. After cross-referencing Jennifer's statement with topographic maps and all information collected from the 2017 file, the TBI, in coordination with the Great Smoky Mountains Ranger Team, launched an on-site survey to identify the suspect cabin in the Greenbrier area. The first step was to compile a list of all old or unregistered cabins within a radius of several miles around the tributaries of Greenbrier Creek. In the Ranger database, more than a dozen wooden structures had been abandoned for many years, but only 3 of them partially matched Jennifer's description. Located deep in the forest, near a small water branch, with no direct access via common vehicle roads, and reachable by jeep along several secondary trails. This list was further narrowed based on 3 main criteria: degree of isolation, cabin architecture, and feasibility of concealing a person undetected for 4 years. During the field survey, the Rangers led the way along 2 trails not marked on tourist maps. Both showed signs of prior use by high-clearance vehicles, evident from compacted red dirt and wear marks on exposed rock. The first cabin on the list sat on a low sloping clearing near a larger stream than Jennifer described, and upon close inspection, the investigative team noted that this cabin still had 2 functional, operable windows, completely inconsistent with her description of windows completely boarded shut. The second cabin was located deeper in the forest and had the correct decayed wooden structure and red dirt floor, but the distance to the main trail was far too great for Jennifer to have run in her exhausted state all the way to the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail. Nevertheless, the investigative team still collected soil samples and photographed the door structure for later comparison. The third cabin, situated near a small stream branch and surrounded by dense forest, matched Jennifer's description more closely than the others. The sound of the flowing water at this cabin location corresponded remarkably well with the sound Jennifer described in her statement, due to the moderate strength of the current and the echo pattern consistent with pressing an ear against the cabin's wooden wall in an enclosed space. Upon approaching the third cabin, the investigative team immediately noted several standout features. The front door had an exterior metal lock that was rusted but still showed fresher friction marks compared to the rest of the cabin, indicating recent manipulation of the lock within the past few years. The door edge displayed small pry marks, not large enough to damage the structure, but sufficient to show force applied from the inside, consistent with Jennifer's description of using a metal bar to force the latch. The ground surrounding the cabin was covered in characteristic red dirt, with unevenly compacted patches, forming a movement pattern compatible with repeated human traffic along the path to the cabin entrance. The Rangers also discovered wear marks on 2 trees near the entrance, at a height corresponding to where a person's hands would grip while stepping up onto the uneven wooden foundation. This was an important supplementary detail because Jennifer had described difficulty moving when exiting the cabin due to the dirt floor and terrain. When examining the area behind the cabin where Jennifer said the generator was located, the investigative team found a rotted wooden platform and scattered metal fragments bearing traces of motor oil, consistent with the structure of a small fuel-powered generator. Although the generator itself was no longer present, the soil showed deep oil penetration, and the wood had faint scorch marks, indicating a hot-running device had operated continuously there, reinforcing the statement that the cabin was sustained by temporary power. In addition, the forensic team discovered small fragments of rope mixed into the soil with uneven degrees of decay, suspected to have once been used for binding or hanging items. To determine whether the cabin had been in use over the past 4 years, the TBI collected samples from multiple points: soil from the cabin floor to test for skin cells or organic traces, wood from the interior door surface to look for metal marks caused by prying, fibers from the wooden cot, and soil from the generator area to analyze for oil. Forensic specialists noted several characteristic wear patterns on the floor surface inside the cabin, not caused by animals that were consistent with limited human footsteps in a confined space. Beneath one floorboard near the cot, they also found a very small piece of pale gray fabric, matching the material of the shirt Jennifer was wearing when discovered. It was sealed for microscopic analysis. Beyond the cabin itself, the Rangers continued surveying the surrounding trails for signs of recent vehicle passage over the past few years. Several deeply compacted soil sections indicated that a vehicle of approximately Jeep Grand Cherokee weight had moved through the area, though on an irregular cycle consistent with the statement that Patrick did not appear on any fixed schedule. There were no signs of other habitation within hundreds of meters around the cabin, confirming that the location was sufficiently isolated to conceal a person for an extended period without detection. These initial findings strongly supported the possibility that the third cabin was the site where Jennifer was held. Upon completing the field survey, the investigative team compiled a detailed report incorporating photographs, maps, terrain measurements, and collected samples to submit for forensic analysis, thereby determining the degree of match between Jennifer's statement and the suspect cabin. When synthesizing all the evidence, cabin structure, proximity to a stream, lock and latch marks, red dirt floor, door pry marks, motor oil samples, and irregular vehicle movement patterns, everything indicated a very high probability that this cabin had been in use over the past 4 years and aligned closely with the specific details Jennifer provided. After the suspect cabin was determined to have a high degree of match with Jennifer's description, the TBI forensic team initiated a scene examination, following the standard protocol for spaces suspected of being used for long-term confinement. They began by establishing a full perimeter cordon and marking every potential contact area to prevent disturbance of surface structures. The cabin floor, wooden walls, cot inside, and all remaining items were scanned using blue light illumination and microscopic trace detection equipment to locate organic debris or signs of bodily fluids left on the wooden surfaces. The forensic team documented clearly worn areas on the floor near the cot and close to the door, indications that someone had repeatedly moved within the confined space. On the cabin walls, multiple locations showed small scratches and discolored patches at heights consistent with an adult's reach under low-light conditions, reflecting the victim's attempts to find support or move along the walls while movement was restricted. These locations were flagged for collection of dust and potential wood fibers that might contain human skin cells. During the microscopic vacuum sampling of the cabin floor, the forensic team recovered 3 strands of hair of varying lengths near the edge of the wooden cot. The hair strands were placed in sterile tubes and immediately sent to the laboratory for DNA comparison with Jennifer's biological samples. Along with the hair, the specialists also noted an extremely small piece of fabric caught under one of the cot's wooden slats, pale gray in color and slightly frayed, matching the material of the shirt Jennifer was wearing when found. When examining near the cabin door, the forensic team discovered a darkened brown streak on the wood surface adjacent to the hinge, suspected to be old blood. This streak was collected using layered sampling technique to avoid contamination and sent for biological analysis. Preliminary scene results indicated the residue had adhesion characteristics consistent with a bodily fluid that had dried under prolonged stagnant air conditions. All of these samples were sealed according to proper chain of custody protocol to preserve their future evidentiary value. In addition to victim-related traces, the examination team also searched for evidence connected to the person maintaining the cabin. On the dirt ground right outside the door, forensics located faint shoe impressions where the red soil had been unevenly compacted, forming a tread pattern consistent with the size and shape of an adult male shoe. Although the sole pattern details were no longer clear, the overall dimensions and weight distribution shown by the depth of compression aligned with the estimated height and build of Patrick Reeves. The investigative team photographed the prints, measured their length and width, and took soil casts for further analysis. These data helped strengthen the likelihood that Patrick had repeatedly entered and exited the cabin during the period matching Jennifer's statement. Through inspection of the remaining items inside the cabin, the forensic team noted the presence of numerous empty canned food tins stacked in a corner. Most were expired between 2018 and 2019, consistent with Jennifer's account that during the early phase, she received food at low frequency and often had to consume old provisions. Many of the cans showed signs of having been opened with a crude knife or hard object rather than proper kitchen tools, indicating the person using the cabin did not maintain normal living conditions, but only performed the bare minimum to sustain the person inside. These items were collected for fingerprint or residual skin cell analysis, although the likelihood of clear biological samples remaining after many years was low. At the rear of the cabin where Jennifer had described the generator being located, the forensic team found a fuel drum still containing about 1/3 of its original capacity. The surface showed dried oil streaks running from the rim down the body. The drum was examined for metal oxidation levels and oil sediment settling to estimate usage duration. Specialists determined that the degree of wear and the characteristic cracking dryness on the drum walls were consistent with equipment used over a 3 to 5 year period, very close to the time frame Jennifer was held. In addition to the fuel drum, several small metal fragments from generator components, including bolts, washers, and a rusted filter screen were collected as comparison samples to identify the type of generator Patrick may have used. The soil directly beneath the generator placement site showed deep oil staining that had soaked into the red dirt, creating darker streaks than the surrounding soil, and indicating the device had operated regularly and leaked over many years. This was a key indicator, as Jennifer described the generator noise as a continuous, repeating sound throughout her long confinement. During the examination, the forensic team also documented scratches on the cabin door, especially around the secondary latch area, showing friction patterns consistent with using a small metal object to apply prying force, matching Jennifer's description of the metal bar she used during her escape. Specialists measured the pry grooves on the door surface to determine the direction of force and the type of tool likely responsible. Upon close analysis, the pry marks showed force applied from the inside in a horizontal direction, not from the exterior. All collected evidence, including hair, fabric sample, blood sample, generator bolts, fuel drum, shoe impressions, and food cans, was sealed according to forensic standards and transferred to the laboratory for advanced analysis, forming a direct data set, linking the suspect cabin to Jennifer's description and to the characteristics of the person who held her captive. After compiling all the data from Jennifer's statement, the evidence recovered at the cabin, and the personnel records from the company where she had worked, the TBI behavioral analysis team proceeded to construct a criminal profile of Patrick Reeves. They began by identifying the motive stemming from the risk of being reported to the Human Resources Department. According to expert assessment, Patrick was not only concerned about the impact on his managerial position, but also feared an internal investigation that could lead to job loss, damage to his reputation, and even potential legal liability if the harassment allegations were substantiated. Internal email records and reports from coworkers showed that Jennifer had come very close to filing a formal complaint, while Patrick showed signs of becoming aware of this through his observation of Jennifer's behavior in the final weeks. The combination of motive to avoid consequences and his inherent controlling attitude led Patrick to form an extreme response, resulting in approaching the victim right before she left work and carrying out an assault with the specific purpose of preventing the report. From this evidence, the TBI determined that Patrick did not act impulsively but with elements of premeditation, demonstrated by his choice of timing when Jennifer left the office in the late afternoon as foot traffic began to decrease. The criminal profile was built around a sequence of behaviors: approach, assault, coercive imposition, transport, confinement, sustained control. Patrick began by finding a pretext to make contact with Jennifer in the parking lot, exploiting a low-traffic location to deliver a blow to her head that rendered her unconscious. This behavior indicated initiative, calculation, and the use of surprise to eliminate any possibility of resistance. Placing Jennifer into his Jeep Grand Cherokee and immediately driving away from populated areas demonstrated intent to isolate the victim from any location where she might be seen or signal for help. Patrick then engaged in acts aimed at imposing submission on Jennifer, using them as tools to reinforce his position of control. These actions were described by Jennifer in softened language, but still clearly revealed a nature directed toward domination and the complete suppression of resistance. One particularly critical element in the behavioral analysis of Patrick was his long-term maintenance of control through deliberate starvation tactics. The TBI concluded that providing minimal, nutritionally insufficient food portions over many years was not a passive consequence of neglect, but a calculated control strategy. Prolonged malnutrition led to reduced physical strength, impaired cognitive function, and made it difficult for the victim to formulate escape plans. A body deprived of energy also diminished survival reflexes, causing Jennifer to fall into a state of complete dependence on the person supplying food. When combined with deprivation of light, restricted movement, and the cabin being locked from the outside, Patrick created a sealed environment in which Jennifer could scarcely maintain the physical or mental strength needed to resist. This is a tactic commonly seen in secret confinement models, where the perpetrator uses control over basic needs to sustain power. In the geographic motivation analysis, the TBI determined that Patrick's selection of an isolated cabin in Greenbrier was not random, but aligned with the characteristics perpetrators typically seek when intending to hold someone for an extended period. The cabin was located deep in the forest, with no surrounding residences, no visibility from the main road, and accessible only by high-clearance vehicle. This greatly reduced the chance of the cabin being discovered by hikers, making Patrick's comings and goings difficult to record. The cabin structure had no operable windows, with many sections permanently covered, creating conditions for complete darkness and preventing internal sounds from escaping. The presence of a small stream near the cabin also suited Patrick's needs for orientation, while helping mask the generator noise, making the cabin harder to detect. These factors showed that Patrick did not merely seek a hiding place but deliberately chose a structure with characteristics suited to long-term confinement. When compiling the behavioral profile, the TBI Criminal Analysis Group classified Patrick as a long-term control-based captivity offender, commonly referred to as control-based captivity, a pattern typically associated with perpetrators who have a need to exert dominance over the victim, rather than seeking immediate material gain. In this model, the initial assault often stems from a specific trigger, in this case, avoiding exposure. But once the victim is rendered powerless, the offender shifts to maintaining control through a recurring cycle of behaviors: information, isolation, light deprivation, movement restriction, starvation, and unpredictable appearances that keep the victim in a constant state of anxiety and unpredictability. Evidence at the cabin, such as years expired canned food, long-term use of motor oil for the generator, irregular footprint patterns, and the door latch pried from the inside, all aligned with the control-based captivity model, in which the perpetrator sustains the bare minimum for the victim's survival, while ensuring the captive lacks the capacity to escape or fight back. The behavioral profile also noted that Patrick gradually reduced his physical presence at the cabin over time. But this was not a sign of diminishing control needs. Rather, it represented a tactical shift. Once the victim had weakened to the point of being unable to act freely, the perpetrator no longer needed frequent appearances to maintain dominance. The unpredictability of Patrick's visits created a mechanism of remote psychological control, keeping the victim perpetually in a state of anticipation or tension due to not knowing when the perpetrator would return. This is a prominent characteristic in many prolonged secret captivity cases, and is considered one of the factors that caused Jennifer to fall into profound mental exhaustion, reduced reactivity, and difficulty forming escape plans over many years. Through analysis of motive, behavior, and environmental factors, Patrick's criminal profile was completed with full supporting evidence showing that he had maintained a highly structured criminal pattern based on continuous control and the exploitation of every geographic, psychological, and survival element to keep Jennifer in a prolonged state of subjugation. Right after Patrick Reeves' criminal profile was established, the investigative team continued to trace his entire movements from 2017 to 2021 by analyzing financial data, technical records, and scene documentation to build a movement timeline that aligned with Jennifer's statement. The first data source was Patrick's fuel and motor oil purchase transactions during this period. His credit card payment records showed an abnormal pattern. Instead of buying fuel on a stable cycle to meet regular city commuting needs, Patrick purchased large-capacity cans of motor oil at intervals of 1 to 3 months, consistent with the frequency of generator use that Jennifer described. These transactions were typically made at convenience stores or gas stations along the route leading to Greenbrier, not near his official residence in Knoxville after 2017, reinforcing the hypothesis that he regularly traveled into the forest after leaving his job. In addition to motor oil, Patrick's food purchases also showed unusual signs. He frequently bought long shelf-life canned goods, but always in very small quantities, typically only 2 to 5 items, consistent with providing the bare minimum food supply to Jennifer in the cabin. The investigative team continued cross-referencing information about rented or abandoned cabins through ranger records, property ownership lists, and forest maintenance reports. None of the legally registered cabins in the area recorded Patrick as a tenant or registered user. However, when checking records related to abandoned cabins, 2 of the 3 suspect cabins showed evidence of prior unauthorized entry, but the third cabin, the one that matched Jennifer's description, and the collected physical evidence, had no official record whatsoever throughout the 4 years. This indicated that Patrick deliberately chose a cabin where his presence would go undetected or unreported. Wear marks on the trails, including red dirt compacted in tire track patterns matching the dimensions of a Jeep Grand Cherokee, were cross-referenced with terrain data to reconstruct the likely route Patrick used. Reviewing traffic camera footage in the Greenbrier area was the next step. Although the National Park's camera system did not cover every road, cameras on the main roads leading into Greenbrier captured multiple instances of a Jeep matching the shape and color of Patrick's vehicle during the 2017-2019 period. Some images allowed partial identification of a blurry license plate that corresponded to the vehicle registered in his name. Notably, footage from September 2018 and March 2019 recorded the Jeep appearing during evening hours when traffic was minimal, a pattern that aligned with Jennifer's description that Patrick rarely visited the cabin during daylight. The vehicle's irregular appearances on camera also reflected the inconsistent schedule of Patrick's cabin visits, an element Jennifer emphasized repeatedly in her statement. The Technical Data Analysis Group further assessed Patrick's frequency of presence in the forest, using information from mobile devices, network access points, and cell tower signals within the forest range. Although Patrick did not actively use his phone during forest visits, several weak signal pings from his device were recorded on the edge of Greenbrier, proving his presence in the area at times that matched Jennifer's accounts of food or water supply periods. Although these data points were not continuous, they formed a reasonably consistent pattern of appearances that aligned with the victim's description of Patrick visiting the cabin on an irregular but still sustained basis over a long period. Based on transaction data, camera footage, device signals, and Patrick's mobility capabilities, the investigative team constructed a detailed timeline from 2017 to 2021, marking each recorded appearance in the Greenbrier area and comparing it with the frequency Jennifer described. The timeline showed that during the first 3 months after Jennifer was taken, Patrick appeared in Greenbrier more frequently, with intervals of 3 to 5 days. After that initial phase, his appearances gradually decreased, sometimes stretching to a week or longer, consistent with Jennifer's description of Patrick shifting to a more neglectful pattern, while still returning regularly enough to maintain her dependence on food and water supplies. During the expanded investigation, the TBI also retrieved records from the company where Patrick had previously worked. Information from the Human Resources Department and co-workers confirmed that immediately after the date Jennifer escaped from the cabin, specifically May 25, 2021, Patrick submitted his resignation without providing any specific reason. At the same time, from that day onward, he never returned to the company, did not respond to any phone calls, emails, or other forms of contact, indicating a sudden disappearance behavior likely directly related to Jennifer's escape. Submitting his resignation immediately after this point was viewed as an avoidance action and a strong indicator of guilt when the perpetrator realizes the victim has freed herself and could report what happened. The company records also supported the behavioral analysis model. Patrick attempted to sever all social connections after losing control over the victim. All the data from financial transactions, traffic footage, device signals, ranger records, and company files combined to form a consistent movement chain, enabling the investigative team to establish a timeline that matched almost perfectly with Jennifer's statement about Patrick's appearances and disappearances throughout the 4 years she was confined, while also clarifying his pattern of entering and exiting the Greenbrier area during the entire period of the offense. The identification session at Parkway was conducted under tightly controlled conditions with the goal of reactivating Jennifer's memories in an environment crowded with people, yet safe enough for her to observe, without directly facing any risk. Jennifer was positioned inside a specialized vehicle, parked at a spot offering a clear view of the flow of people moving along this bustling tourist route. Investigators were scattered throughout the crowd, posing as tourists or shop employees, ensuring no one outside the team knew the purpose of the session. At that time, internal security information from Parkway indicated that a man had been appearing continuously for several consecutive days, often alone, exhibiting behavior of scanning the surroundings as though waiting or probing for something. Recognizing the coincidence with the characteristics of the suspect being sought, the investigative team added Parkway to the list of locations under surveillance. While Jennifer watched the stream of people passing in front of her, she initially saw only shadows and different figures blending into the lights and busy activity of the tourists. But when a man wearing a dark baseball cap and a light jacket walked close to the shops with his head down, Jennifer began to pay attention. This man did not look around like an ordinary tourist. Instead, he moved quickly, constantly adjusting his cap, trying to shield his face by tilting his head every time he passed a public camera. Investigators secretly positioned near that area also noted the same behavior, especially the way he kept glancing in different directions in the manner of someone calculating an escape route. When he passed directly across the street from the vehicle where Jennifer was seated, she felt a powerful bodily reaction even before she could consciously identify the source. That gait, the slightly uneven rhythm of his steps, and the way he tensed his shoulders while moving instantly triggered a familiar sensation that her mind could not explain rationally. She froze, eyes locked on the figure, trying to blend into the crowd. It was not his face, not his voice, but the very movement of his body that caused 4 years of memories from the cabin to surge back like a reflex. The investigators, discreetly positioned around the area, immediately noticed the change in Jennifer's expression. Her body tensed, breathing became rapid, and her gaze never left the man heading toward River Road. One investigator quietly asked for confirmation, and Jennifer managed only a few broken words, but they were clear enough for the team to understand that she believed this man was Patrick. In that moment, it seemed Patrick sensed the attention turning toward him. He suddenly accelerated, changing direction by slipping through a group of tourists standing at a souvenir stall, then cutting sharply into a narrow alley leading behind one of the buildings. This unusual evasive action immediately shifted the entire surveillance team hidden in the area into limited pursuit mode, ensuring they did not lose sight of him while maintaining distance to avoid causing panic in the crowd. Investigators stationed at the front of Parkway recorded the moment Patrick sped up at approximately 3:42 p.m., with his initial turn heading toward the curved section near the River Road entrance. Another group positioned along the rear of the shops observed him emerge from the tight passage between two buildings and continue toward the trail leading to the rear parking lot. His gait became more hurried, each step striking the ground hard like someone trying to run without openly showing flight. Jennifer followed the developments through rapid descriptions from the investigator seated beside her, and provided additional confirmation of behavioral traits she had witnessed in the cabin. The way he leaned his body while running, the habit of clenching his right hand tightly then releasing it during tension, and the manner of twisting his head to check behind while his body continued forward. All these details made her even more certain that this man was Patrick and not some coincidence. The surveillance team on the north side of Parkway noted that Patrick did not choose the crowded main route but headed toward the alley leading to the side road connecting to Cherokee Orchard Road, a route the investigators had anticipated, because it was the quickest way off the main road to avoid identification. By the time he reached the second intersection, he was almost fully running, head down low, one hand pulling his cap over his face, the other arm pressed tight against his body to avoid drawing attention. The agents immediately broadcast the last recorded position over radio. Patrick left Parkway at the Cherokee Orchard Road intersection when the clock marked 3:44 p.m. This moment was officially logged by the surveillance team as the point when the suspect exited direct visual observation. Agents in the surrounding area continued to follow discreetly without revealing their positions, while Jennifer was removed from the area for safety. The identification session concluded with confirmation that the suspect had appeared precisely at Parkway at the exact time the team was monitoring, and his reactive behavior when noticed fully matched that of a person attempting to conceal his identity after many years of criminal activity and evasion. The pursuit of Patrick Reeves expanded from the Parkway area to the edge of Pigeon Forge, allowing the special agents to gradually close the distance and advance toward a blocking point where intersecting roads provided sufficient coverage to deploy a three-direction containment tactic. The Jeep Grand Cherokee he used during the flight was identified by patrol radar as matching the exact characteristics recorded from the camera sequences, so traffic control units assisted in sealing off routes by adjusting vehicle flow to eliminate any escape options for the suspect. When Patrick accelerated on the stretch leading toward the area bordering Wares Valley Road, two agent vehicles immediately closed in from both sides, forcing him to swerve into an empty parking lot behind a row of commercial buildings. At this location, the open space allowed agents to approach from multiple angles while remaining discreet enough to avoid causing panic among nearby civilians. When Patrick opened the car door intending to flee on foot, two agents moved in to subdue him, ordering him to drop his hands and get on his knees. He did not resist strongly but was clearly disoriented, his eyes darting around as though searching for another escape direction. The Jeep was sealed on site according to forensic protocol, with all contact surfaces restricted using specialized gloves. The vehicle was then transported to a mobile examination area for immediate on-scene processing, avoiding the risk of evidence displacement during a long-distance move. When the rear hatch was opened, the forensic team discovered two lengths of silver-gray synthetic rope with old friction marks on the surface, and both ends curled from previous tightening force. These rope segments were collected using sterile forceps, placed in sealed evidence bags, and assigned unique identification codes. Under the passenger seat was a thick jacket. The outer layer was particularly coated with red dirt, matching the soil color at the cabin in Greenbrier. Forensic personnel collected soil samples from the jacket and from under the floor mat for comparison with soil samples taken at the cabin scene. In the trunk, there was also a small-capacity motor oil drum bearing the same brand and size as the drum found behind the cabin. The oil streaks around the drum's opening showed darkening and adhesion characteristics similar to the oil residue on the cabin's ground surface, indicating that Patrick likely transported equipment or fuel for the same type of generator Jennifer described. All of these items were photographed on-site, coded, and sealed according to standard forensic procedures to ensure integrity and eliminate the possibility of cross-contamination. After completing the vehicle examination, authorities executed a search warrant at Patrick's residence in Knoxville to seize any documents, items, or traces related to the cabin or the confinement process. His apartment was located in an older complex and showed no signs of regular occupancy. In the living room, a desk drawer contained a detailed printed map of the Greenbrier area and its secondary forest trails. On the map were 3 red ink markings, one of which exactly matched the position of the cabin identified during the field survey. Beneath the map was a small notebook containing scattered notations, time markers, numbers corresponding to dates or distances, interspersed with brief notes describing weather conditions or forest road status. These notations were regarded as potential evidence reflecting Patrick's actual schedule of forest visits and likely matching the frequency of appearances Jennifer described throughout her confinement period. Continuing the search into the storage room, forensic personnel found 2 rolls of specialized nylon rope, 1 roll of black fiber duct tape, and a box containing various metal items such as screws, bolts, and small tool fragments, possibly used to repair or reinforce the cabin door. All of these items were seized for fingerprint analysis, fiber structure examination, and potential linkage to traces remaining in the cabin. Additionally, a large pair of shoes with red dirt caked on the soles and tread patterns matching the shoe impressions recovered near the cabin entrance were collected and sealed. The degree of soil adhesion on the shoes reflected movement through terrain consistent with the location where Jennifer was held. The evidence seizure log at the apartment was meticulously prepared. Each item was assigned an identifier, described in detail, photographed on site, and entered into the inventory. The forensic team took special care to prevent mixing evidence from different areas of the residence to preserve the integrity of subsequent analysis. All evidence from the vehicle and the residence was transported to the laboratory via two separate, independent routes to eliminate any possibility of cross-contamination during transit. Preliminary comparison showed that the soil color on the jacket and under the vehicle floor mat had particle size and mineral composition matching the red dirt at the cabin. The rope fiber structure from the vehicle matched the indentations recorded on the soft tissue of Jennifer's wrists in her medical file. The motor oil drum was the same type and showed comparable wear to the drum found behind the cabin. The shoes seized from the residence matched the size, weight, and sole pattern of the shoe impressions recovered at the scene. The map and notebook constituted key evidence directly connecting Patrick's real-world movements to the cabin location Jennifer described. All of these facts formed a consistent chain linking the physical evidence, the scene, the statement, and the suspect's behavior. The process of compiling all forensic evidence related to the case was carried out by connecting Jennifer Collins' statement with the physical evidence recovered at the cabin in Greenbrier, data from Patrick Reeves' Jeep Grand Cherokee, and financial transactions spanning 4 years, thereby reconstructing a continuous and consistent crime timeline. First, the analysis team cross-referenced Jennifer's entire statement about the confinement environment, control mechanisms, and Patrick's behavior against the cabin examination results. The red dirt floor, the small stream sound to the right, motor oil smell, oil stains, door pry marks, footprints, and the cabin's internal structure all matched the victim's description. These physical items, combined with the fabric sample, hair sample, and blood sample that matched Jennifer's DNA, formed a direct chain of evidence confirming that she had been held inside this cabin throughout the entire period of confinement. At the same time, evidence recovered from the Jeep restraining ropes, a jacket coated in red dirt, and a motor oil drum of the same type as the one found at the cabin created an additional physical bridge linking Patrick to the confinement location. Patrick's financial transaction data further strengthened this connection by showing purchases of motor oil, canned food, and travel to gas stations near Greenbrier, occurring on cycles consistent with the pattern of minimal food supply that Jennifer described. From these facts, the investigative team reconstructed the timeline, starting from May 17, 2017, according to the statement. The moment Jennifer was assaulted up to May 25, 2021, the date Jennifer escaped and appeared on the Roaring Fork Motor Nature Trail. The timeline begins with Patrick approaching Jennifer in the office parking lot, assaulting her, placing her in the Jeep, and driving along River Road toward Greenbrier. The locations where the shoulder bag and blood-stained bracelet were recovered in 2017 lie precisely on the route Patrick traveled. Camera footage capturing the Jeep near the Greenbrier entrance on the same evening provides additional proof of the direction of travel. In the initial months following the disappearance, Patrick's transactions showed a higher frequency of motor oil and food purchases, consistent with the phase Jennifer described when he visited the cabin more often and maintained continuous control behavior. From late 2017 through 2018, transaction frequency decreased but still recurred on a cycle, matching the description of Patrick beginning to shift toward a more neglectful pattern while still providing the bare minimum supplies. Cell tower ping data on the edge of Greenbrier matched Patrick's forest visits according to the statement. Weak pings appeared at times. Jennifer described him arriving at the cabin after several days of absence. Oil samples collected from the cabin and from the oil drum in Patrick's vehicle matched each other chemically, proving continuity in maintaining the generator used for the confinement. During the 2019-2020 period, purchases of canned food appeared sporadically and lacked any pattern of personal consumption, aligning more closely with a model of providing minimal and irregular food to a captive person. This perfectly matched Jennifer's description that her food portions were gradually reduced over time. Investigators also noted that every anomalous transaction in Knoxville, such as purchases of repair materials, binding rope, or motor oil, corresponded to periods when the cabin was being maintained or lightly repaired, as evidenced by wear marks on generator components recovered by the forensic team. The timeline further showed alignment between Patrick's change of residence and his decreasing presence at work, with the deepening progression of criminal behavior. Specifically, just 2 weeks after Jennifer's disappearance, Patrick submitted his resignation and moved out of Gatlinburg. Company records noted co-workers describing Patrick at that time as tense, anxious, and avoiding any questions related to Jennifer. When cross-referenced with Jennifer's internal email, the investigative team confirmed the crime motive. Jennifer had prepared an HR report regarding Patrick's harassing behavior. This was a strong and direct motive considered the starting point for the entire chain of prolonged confinement actions. Throughout the 4 years, Patrick left no legal transaction trail tied to the cabin, proving that choosing an abandoned cabin was a deliberate act to avoid detection. Evidence from Patrick's residence, such as the forest map marked with the cabin location and the notebook containing notations of travel dates, matched every point in the reconstructed timeline. These notations corresponded to cycles when he entered the forest to bring food, repair the generator, or check on the cabin. The chain of facts demonstrated that the confinement behavior was not impulsive but a planned, extended process with a clear repeating pattern. Deliver food, exert control, leave alone, return, maintain minimal survival conditions fully consistent with the control-based captivity crime model. The timeline from May 17, 2017 to May 25, 2021, when all forensic evidence, physical items, transaction data, camera footage, and the statement are combined, becomes so consistent that no point contradicts another. Investigators compiled a complete criminal case file, including a detailed timeline of each of Patrick's visits to the cabin, each transaction related to maintaining the confinement, and each piece of evidence directly connecting Patrick to the environment where Jennifer was held. All data was synthesized into a structured legal dossier ready for prosecution, clearly demonstrating intentional, prolonged, continuous criminal conduct sustained through physical, financial, and geographic means. At the trial, the prosecutor presented to the jury the entire body of forensic evidence collected during the investigation, starting from the cabin in Greenbrier, the Jeep Grand Cherokee, and Patrick Reeves' residence, linking each piece of evidence to Jennifer Collins' statement through scientific cross-referencing methods. The hair samples, fabric fibers, and blood samples recovered from the cabin were all DNA analyzed and proven to be a complete match with Jennifer, confirming her presence in that space throughout the many years of confinement. The pry marks on the cabin door were described by a physics expert as having cut patterns consistent with force applied from the inside and compatible with the metal bar Jennifer described using during her escape. The red dirt adhering to the jacket inside the Jeep and on the soles of the shoes seized from Patrick's apartment had the same mineral composition, color, and fineness as the soil at the cabin, confirmed by the Geological Analysis Unit to be from the same source. Oil samples from the cabin and from the oil drum in Patrick's Jeep showed identical chemical composition and degradation indices, indicating the same type of fuel had been used to operate a small, long-running generator. All of these forensic analyses were presented in a clear, organized manner, grouped by theme: evidence related to confinement, evidence related to transportation, and evidence related to preparatory behavior. The digital investigation team then presented the traffic camera history, in which footage of Patrick's Jeep appearing on the evening of May 17, 2017 on the road leading into Greenbrier was shown to the jury. Although the camera did not capture a clear license plate, the match in vehicle shape, color, and taillight structure was analyzed and assessed as having a high degree of compatibility. At the same time, financial data was introduced. Transactions for purchasing motor oil drums, long shelf-life canned food, and repair supplies scattered throughout the 4 years matched Jennifer's statement about the pattern of intermittent neglect combined with control that Patrick employed. The second part of the trial focused on verifying the workplace harassment behavior, thereby clarifying the motive for the crime. Former co-workers of Jennifer were called as witnesses and described instances in which they saw Patrick attempting to approach her in office hallways, exerting pressure during meetings, and engaging in inappropriate conduct. The Human Resources Department provided email records showing that Jennifer had been preparing to submit a formal report, along with evidence that Patrick had deleted several related messages shortly after Jennifer disappeared. These testimonies reinforced the prosecution's argument that Patrick had a direct, clear, and explosive motive when he perceived the risk of being reported. Next, a forensic medical expert was called to testify about Jennifer's physical condition when she was found. Based on medical records, The doctor described wrist injuries consistent with prolonged rope binding, with old indentations interspersed with newer ones, along with soft tissue injuries reflecting extended malnutrition. The degree of weight loss, skin muscle indices, time disorientation, and panic reflexes when encountering strangers were all analyzed as direct consequences of the secret isolation-style confinement model. The prosecution asked the expert to compare Jennifer's injuries with patterns documented in other confinement cases, and the conclusion was presented. All signs were consistent with the victim being held in a confined space, lacking light, lacking adequate food, and offering no opportunity for social contact. These assessments helped the jury clearly understand the prolonged nature and the severe physical-psychological impact Jennifer endured. During the defense portion, the defense attempted to argue that Patrick could not have been the one holding Jennifer because there was no direct video evidence inside the cabin, but this argument was quickly dismissed based on the high-consistency, high-match forensic evidence package. The defense then tried to suggest that the cabin could have been used by someone else, but the prosecution countered with positioning data, financial transactions, shoe impressions, fabric fibers, the forest map, and evidence from the Jeep to prove that only Patrick appeared at the relevant locations. The prosecution emphasized that Patrick's absence from work immediately after Jennifer's escape, together with his complete disappearance from all contact, constituted clear, evasive behavior. Every defense argument suggesting Patrick had been set up was rebutted by the investigative team using chemical and geological evidence, because the level of match between the items and the cabin environment could not have occurred by chance. As the trial reached the summation phase, the prosecution delivered the closing argument, stressing that the entire chain of behavior from the motive to avoid being reported, the initial assault, the transport to Greenbrier, the prolonged confinement, the deliberate neglect, the use of the generator, the minimal food provision, to the unusual reappearance at Parkway, formed a continuous, intentional, behavioral structure, not random, not accidental. The closing argument connected all evidence lines into a unified system. The victim's statement matched the cabin. The cabin matched the physical evidence. The physical evidence matched the Jeep and the apartment. Financial transactions matched preparatory and maintenance behavior. Camera data matched the movement timeline. The prosecution concluded that Patrick Reeves's conduct fully satisfied the elements of the crimes of unlawful imprisonment, causing injury and related offenses, and requested that the jury consider the gravity of the case based on the scientific evidence, witness testimony, and forensic conclusions that had been presented. At the sentencing hearing, the court panel entered the deliberation phase after many days of reviewing all forensic evidence, witness testimony, and arguments between the prosecution and defense counsel before delivering the final determination of Patrick Reeves's criminal responsibility in the 4-year-long unlawful confinement of Jennifer Collins. When the judge read the initial verdict, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. The jury found Patrick guilty of a total of 5 serious offenses, including assault causing injury, unlawful imprisonment, causing long-term physical and mental harm to the victim, threatening and coercive behavior resulting in loss of liberty, and the offense of using an unauthorized residence to facilitate confinement. The prosecutor briefly restated in a few concise sentences that Patrick's entire chain of conduct from approaching Jennifer in the company parking lot on May 17, 2017, to the moment she escaped on May 23, 2021, matched a pattern of premeditated, sustained, and clearly intentional criminal behavior, not impulsive or uncontrolled actions, as the defense had attempted to argue. Based on the jury's findings, the sentencing panel reached the decision to impose a combined sentence of 74 years in prison, without parole, without sentence reduction, and without eligibility for clemency at any stage of sentence execution. When the judge announced the sentence, Patrick showed little reaction, simply lowering his head and remaining silent, while representatives of Jennifer's family were present in the courtroom throughout the entire proceeding. The application of a combined 74-year term was explained based on the exceptionally grave nature of the conduct. Prolonged confinement under inhumane conditions, causing profound physical and psychological damage to the victim, deliberate concealment of the crime over many years, and continued evasion of responsibility even after Jennifer escaped and was located. Following the sentencing, the offender classification file was immediately prepared in the courtroom, in which Patrick was categorized as a high-risk inmate exhibiting long-term controlling behavior requiring special management at a maximum security facility. The court security unit transferred Patrick to the Special Prisoner Transport Team for delivery to the Central Detention Facility, where he would undergo an initial assessment phase before being assigned to an appropriate housing unit. In the offender classification log, specialists explicitly noted that Patrick posed a risk of re-engaging in controlling behavior if exposed to vulnerable inmates, therefore requiring segregated confinement for the majority of his sentence term, along with maximum restriction on access to any information sources that could facilitate similar control patterns. The Court Records Management Unit then proceeded to close the case file, assign the final identification code, and transfer the complete judgment, trial minutes, physical evidence, and accompanying documents to the archives. An official notification was sent to Jennifer's family confirming that the trial process had concluded and the final sentence had been pronounced. In the notification, the sentencing panel emphasized that the judgment was based on a robust forensic evidence system, victim testimony consistent with physical evidence, and expert conclusions from medical, geological, forensic, and other specialists, as well as the consistency across all data sources. This notification served not only as a procedural formality, but also as formal recognition of the endurance Jennifer suffered throughout 4 years of confinement, while affirming that the justice system had fully acknowledged and addressed Patrick's criminal responsibility. Representatives of Jennifer's family received the notification with the acknowledgement that they had waited many years for this moment when everything Jennifer endured was legally recognized and the person responsible for her suffering faced an appropriate sentence. Once the judgment handover process was complete, the case file was officially sealed. After the trial concluded and Patrick Reeves's sentence was pronounced, Jennifer Collins' medical and psychological records continued to be directly monitored at the Knoxville Treatment Center, where rehabilitation physicians and psychologists worked together to assess the extent of damage following 4 years of isolation in the cabin at Greenbrier. Jennifer showed progress in physical strength. Her mobility gradually improved through basic therapy exercises, her body gained weight slowly but steadily, and her heart rate and blood pressure returned to more stable levels compared to when she was first discovered. Nevertheless, some limitations remained, such as low endurance, excessive defensive reflexes to loud noises, and difficulty maintaining a relaxed state in crowded environments. Her psychological file indicated avoidance behavior when enclosed spaces were mentioned, and particular sensitivity to generator sounds, consistent with what experts diagnosed as a typical response in individuals who have endured prolonged isolation. In therapy, Jennifer was placed on a controlled exposure program, combined with emotional stabilization techniques, allowing her to gradually regain a sense of safety without being forced to confront strongly triggering memories. Social reintegration was evaluated as a complex process. Specialists at Knoxville noted that Jennifer struggled to process ordinary social stimuli such as laughter, bright lights, or sudden changes in daily routine. Rebuilding social interactions required support through life skills rebuilding sessions, including basic communication, planning a daily schedule, or participating in small group activities. Having been deprived of social contact for 4 years, her brain had to readjust to linear time perception, so she still had difficulty distinguishing 1 hour passing from 1 afternoon passing, a manifestation commonly seen in victims held in environments lacking light and time cues. The medical specialist panel at Knoxville assessed Jennifer's post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as severe, with symptoms including cabin memory flashbacks, panic attacks triggered by loud footsteps or metallic clanging, and persistent hypervigilance. Jennifer was recommended to continue a PTSD treatment regimen, combining talk therapy, memory processing therapy, and techniques for managing memory overload. Additionally, neurologists evaluated that Jennifer would likely require long-term support due to central nervous system impacts from chronic sleep deprivation, light deprivation, and sustained stress, resulting in disturbances in spatial and temporal perception. On the community level, the cabin where Jennifer was held became a highly debated topic in the Greenbrier area. Local residents demanded clear information to alleviate concerns that abandoned cabins could be exploited for criminal purposes. Some community groups proposed that rangers conduct regular inspections of all unregistered cabins in the forest to ensure no structures were being used illegally. The cabin where Jennifer was confined has now been cordoned off and posted with warning signs in accordance with Tennessee regulations, and it is regarded as a forensic research site to train investigative teams on identifying patterns of secret confinement in remote forested mountain areas. Community debate also centered on how someone could be held for years without detection, leading to town hall meetings in Sevier County to discuss responsibility for monitoring forest spaces and improving information sharing between rangers, local police, and residents to prevent similar cases. Jennifer's case also had a significant impact on Tennessee's legal system, particularly in the handling of missing person cases that transition into cold cases. After the case file was finalized, state investigative units began updating old data review methods to avoid overlooking leads, as had happened with Jennifer's bracelet and shoulder bag, initially deemed unrelated due to lack of early context. The most visible impact was the requirement for Tennessee agencies to re-inventory all unregistered cabins in national forest areas, increase periodic inspections, and strengthen coordination among rangers, local police, and state investigators. Tennessee courts also recommended developing a new forensic standard for suspected long-term confinement cases in remote environments, based on the forensic findings from Jennifer's cabin. The case became a textbook example in internal investigative workshops, highlighting the importance of connecting victim statements with scene evidence, movement data, and behavioral analysis to accurately reconstruct timelines. In the public sphere, Jennifer Collins's case spotlighted gaps in monitoring dangerous workplace behavior, prompting many local businesses to review their harassment and abuse reporting procedures. In this context, Jennifer's ongoing recovery in Knoxville held meaning not only for her family but for the broader community, as it affirmed that victims of secret confinement can still be supported to rebuild their lives, while helping Tennessee strengthen its legal and investigative standards to prevent similar cases in the future. Jennifer Collins's story reflects a reality that many communities across the United States continue to face: the combination of workplace harassment, gaps in oversight of public spaces, and prolonged silence when victims are not protected in time. In this case, warning signs had already appeared beforehand. Jennifer's emails prepared for HR, Patrick's persistent following behavior in the office, and the anxiety co-workers had witnessed. But as in many real-life situations in America, workplace environments sometimes lack early intervention procedures and allow matters to slide until tragedy occurs. This serves as a reminder to Americans that training to recognize harassment, establishing clear reporting processes, and protecting whistleblowers are not merely formalities, they can save a life. The second lesson comes from the fact that Jennifer was held for 4 years in an abandoned cabin in Greenbrier without anyone noticing. This is a powerful reminder that blind spots in monitoring forest areas, trails, and remote locations still exist in many states, especially Tennessee, Montana, Colorado, or Oregon. While it is a practical reality that rangers cannot monitor every abandoned cabin, communities can share responsibility by reporting strange vehicles, cabins showing signs of unauthorized use, or unusual activity in the woods. In this story, Patrick's Jeep Grand Cherokee appeared multiple times in the Greenbrier area without receiving proper attention, a detail that reflects a surveillance issue many American localities are now working to improve. Finally, Jennifer's recovery journey offers Americans an important lesson. Freedom is not only a legal value, but a spiritual one that must be protected. PTSD, loss of time perception, fear of generator sounds, all of these show the long-term consequences that violence and confinement inflict on a human being. Therefore, the lesson is not only stay vigilant, but also to create an environment where victims are believed, heard, and properly supported, so they can return to life, just as Knoxville has supported Jennifer throughout her therapy process. Thank you for following Jennifer Collins' entire painful yet resilient journey. If you find this story important and worth sharing, please hit subscribe to join us. See you in the next video, where we continue to confront the hard-to-say truths, so no victim ever has to fight in silence.